In this podcast, podcast 4, I'm joined by Professor Deirdre Shaw, main advisor to the research, and our guest, Professor Sophie Woodward from the University of Manchester, to discuss the methodology and methods applied to my research. During the podcast, we will share insights from multi-method qualitative consumer behaviour research experiences. We will unpack and explain how the methods selected help to address the challenges and opportunities of consumer behaviour in the transition to clothing circularity in a circular economy. Welcome, Deirdre and Sophie, to this 4th podcast in the series, where we will be discussing the methodology and the methods that I have applied to my research, which took a qualitative ethnographic approach, engaging with 30 households in Edinburgh. I'm so delighted to be able to chat to Deirdre and Sophie today, and I'm just going to hand over to Deirdre to start us off. Thank you, Deirdre.
Our topic today is the research methodologies applied to Lynn's research. And Lynn and I are delighted to be joined today by Professor Sophie Woodward, who's Professor of Sociology at University of Manchester and the co-investigator for the ESRC-funded National Centre for Research Methods, where Sophie leads on creative methods. Sophie is a member of the Morgan Centre into Everyday Lives, where Sophie applies theories to personal life and everyday relationships of consumers to think through how people relate to things and objects and how relations to each other are mediated through things. Sophie's been researching material culture, everyday life and consumption for over 20 years, including clothing and fashion. So welcome, Sophie. It's great to have you here to help us unpack research methods with consumers as informants. So Sophie, I'd like to start our conversation today by referring to Lynn's research, which used a qualitative multi-method approach, and ask, can you explain for us a bit about multi-method qualitative research and how you've applied it in your own research?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's interesting because often multi-methods historically has been used to talk about the mixture of quantitative and qualitative. But actually, I think it's really exciting to think about how within qualitative methods we can do multi-method research. And in some ways, a kind of methodological approach like ethnography is by definition almost multi-method, because ethnography is the traditional methodological approach in anthropology, but it's been employed in a wide range of disciplines. And the idea of participant observation means that by definition, you're using lots of methods, in that if you're participating and observing, you're going to do that by using interviews, by making notes maybe on your observations. So I think kind of ethnographic methods are by definition multi-method, but there's also lots of other possible kind of creative ways, I think, that we can start to mix different methods. So what I've done within my own research is that I started life as an anthropologist, actually. I'm currently in sociology, but my undergrad and my PhD were in anthropology. And my first research was into women's wardrobes, and that was ethnographic research of women's wardrobes. So that involved watching women choose outfits, kind of observations of how they chose what to wear, and also what they left kind of lying on their bed or what never left the wardrobe. It also involved doing clothing diaries. So I got people to do diaries over a 2-week period where they wrote down what they wore and also what they didn't wear. And I did interviews with people, kind of life history through clothes interviews, as well as doing a kind of audit of the wardrobe. So I got them to go through every item that they had in the wardrobe and tell me about the histories of the things and how they tend to wear it, what memories are associated with it. So that was kind of one example of a multi-method approach I've done. And then in other ones, I've done more specifically targeted things. So for example, I did some research into jeans, where I did object-based interactions, where me and the person who was getting rid of the jeans would kind of talk through the object. And I also did life history interviews, and that was a much more kind of targeted mixed method. So I think there's lots of different ways of doing it, whether you do it as a kind of ethnographic, let's just do a ton of methods and see what happens, or a kind of much more targeted, let's take this method and another one. But I think it's a really fruitful approach, really, to understanding clothing, particularly within the home.
That's a really helpful introduction, Sophie. Thank you so much. Lynn, could I turn to you? I mean, your research was focused on understanding consumer clothing disposal. Could you talk us through a bit about the methods that you applied in that context?
Yeah, thanks, Deirdre, and thanks so much for the question. Yeah, so the purpose of the research was to understand between the consumer use phase of clothing and the disposal decision making. And so I wanted to understand how consumers make that evaluate a garment, a heterogeneous garment, and how it becomes part of that homogeneous clothing disposal system. So in order to do that, I wanted to engage with consumers in the home and sort of really explore with them, get them to share with me what their internal household systems were. And in order to do that, I selected a multi-method approach that included starting with semi-structured interviews. And in those semi-structured interviews, it was about a lot of the time going from room to room in the house, having a discussion, maybe that started in the kitchen, explaining just familiarising myself as the researcher in being welcomed into someone's home. And then you're sort of journeying through the house. And sometimes as I was journeying through the house, asking questions, they were explaining to me perhaps where they had a bit of storage in the hall, on our way to the bedroom, potentially where the majority of clothing was stored and where potentially it was evaluated. And so during this period of conducting the interviews, I was also doing observation. So you're constantly observing the space, trying to understand what's going on in that space in the house and how the household and the participant are managing or engaging in that space. And then, of course, I had photographs that were able to document the space, to document the participant when they were talking about items of clothing and describing why they were either deciding to get rid of that garment or whether they were on the tipping point and they weren't sure whether they were going to dispose of it or not. And then I did other activities such as, where possible, following participants to their clothing disposal point. So whether that was a recycling bank in a car park or a recycling disposal box in a retail outlet. Other activities included sketching. I did some little sketches in my notebook, and I also asked the participants like you, Sophie, I asked them to keep a diary for up to 3 months of their clothing disposal activities and to comment on why they chose those particular disposal activities. And that was really interesting because participants wrote about why they were selling an item. They described that item. They talked about the challenges as well as the accessibility of selling platforms. That was really interesting. And all of this data revealed something completely different. It revealed a different angle to the research questions that I was trying to answer and gave me a really rich set of data.
It's really interesting what you're saying about the diaries, actually, because when I did clothing diaries, I hadn't really planned to do it, but it was a really surprisingly rich source of data, I think, because you just sort of talked about the observations and being there, and I did that too, but actually you can't be there all the time unless you're moving in with people. But what the diaries do is it really helps you to get to those points when you can't be there. And also then when you are there, you can get those reflections on them. So I think they're a really interesting method, actually. And I think for me, they certainly yielded a lot of insights that just wasn't possible with the kind of, even though I did ethnography, I wasn't there all the time. And I'm presuming it was a similar experience for you. And it means then you've got access to that much wider range of practices, valuations, experiences.
Yeah, and I think another point that was really interesting and a bit of a challenge, but at the same time, an opportunity to observe in a different way, was the fact that I did my research. I started my research prior to the lockdown period during the pandemic, and then the other half was done during the pandemic. So this meant that I had to continue some of the second interviews online, or if I was recruiting a new person, I was meeting them online for the first time. And that meant that you were restricted in terms of another thing. As a researcher observer, you've got that opportunity, that tactile opportunity and that sensory opportunity. You know, you're experiencing a space in the participant's home with all your senses. You're experiencing a garment. You get the opportunity to touch it for yourself. But online, on screen, in that two-dimensional space, you don't have that, and you're really relying on a lot more description, a lot more self-observation from the participant, and relying on them using their diaries. And I suppose what the upside of that was, because it was lockdown, people were looking for things to do. So they were much more involved in their diaries in some ways, some of them anyway, and really actually the feedback I got was that it was quite helpful to some of the participants. It started them really thinking about that auditing process, Sophie, that you talked about, asking the participants to audit their wardrobes. And I guess lockdown gave a lot of people an opportunity to audit what was in their house. And I saw that in the diaries, the way that people were sort of writing lists and really explaining the story behind why they disposed of a certain garment in a certain way.
Yeah, that point about the online and the in-person is a really interesting thing. Because I think that on one level, as you say, when you're there in person, you get so many different levels of experience. But then, when you are doing it online, on one level, you don't get that multisensory, but what you do get, I think, is what the participants think are important. So, you know, if they're telling you things or showing you things, you're very much getting, this is what I think matters to me. And so that's actually quite interesting. And when you go in person, you do still get that, but you also see the other stuff. So, you know, they tell you about the thing they really want to tell you about. So I found when I did wardrobe research, they tell me about what I'd call kind of special or exciting occasion clothing. They didn't really want to tell me about their old tracksuit bottoms, but they're all there. And so, you know, actually being there, you start to see those special items in the context of everything else. So I think you get quite different things from the online and the face-to-face. And I think that actually, if you can do both, that's kind of the dream, isn't it? Because you get that participant-led narrative and you understand what's important to people. But then you also, if you go in the home, you get that multisensory element, which is really important, I think, for clothing, actually.
Absolutely. And I think that's so interesting what you say about what participants wanted to talk about compared to what I wanted them or was trying to investigate. So I was really interested in the condition of clothing and where a garment was heavily used, how a participant was engaging with that garment, how they were evaluating that garment for the disposal point. And so what I found was that the more you engaged participants in or positioned your questioning so that you were really picking up on that, they did get really involved. But I did find the more they were talking about perhaps garments that were really heavily used, maybe intimate garments, whether it was underwear that belonged to them or perhaps other members of the household, I could see as the conversation went on, and I was perhaps probing quite a lot about the continuous use of, say, a pair of undergarments. You could see participants getting a little bit drained after a certain period of time. And I think as a researcher, I felt quite responsible, and I wanted to be aware of that and to make sure that I was able to stop at a certain point, you know, to be able to give that participant or informant, as we also say, space and time to relax. I wondered, Sophie, about your experience of that in terms of managing the participation of the informant.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's a really interesting issue, isn't it? Because I think kind of what you were saying about the diaries, people enjoyed it. I certainly found with the research that I've done, the wardrobe research in particular, people loved doing it. They loved an opportunity to talk about their wardrobe. They loved the fact that there was someone there kind of helping them evaluate things and that I was interested in it. But at the same time, I remember doing one wardrobe interview, for example, the first one I did, and it was 3.5 hours. And neither of us had realised it had been that long, I think, because, the person had enjoyed it. But then I became very conscious that actually that was a lot of time for that person to have given. And whilst I sort of had all the time in the world to do it, we do have to kind of moderate our expectations. And this was kind of very early on. And after that, I think I was very conscious about, being attuned to how long we were taking a pause to see if people needed a break from that, because otherwise people do get very involved actually, but you sort of have to balance that without what's a reasonable amount of time to give. And I also think another point in relation to what you said that came to mind was actually around what you can take photos of as well, in that I took photos and, I got full consent to do this in advance, but people sort of sometimes became quite uncomfortable with me taking photos of like their old tracksuit bottoms or something. And so I felt like I did have to keep going back to get that sort of consent almost, because they were very happy for me to take photos of the stuff they love. But then they were like, why are you taking a picture of that? What are you going to do with that? And I'd already checked that it was okay. But I think it's sort of realizing that actually, hold on, this is not something that I consider to be like clothing that I want to be seen. And, and I think that opens up again some really interesting things about doing this research in the home, because people consent to you coming in, but they don't necessarily think through that often stuff in the home is invisible to the public, but you're sort of making it visible, if that makes sense. And I think that's a kind of really interesting thing to negotiate as a researcher.
Yeah, I think for me it was about how I positioned the purpose of the research for the participants. And I think the sort of in the recruitment process, I found really willing participants who were interested in the topic of clothing sustainability, clothing circularity, and they wanted to understand it. So they were really generous in trying to understand why I would be interested in something as opposed to another garment. But then on the other hand, I was interested in all of the garments, because it didn't really matter whether it was brand new and had the labels on, or it was those soiled, laundered but stained pants. I was interested in the whole spectrum. And I think it was just about, for me, it was about taking them on that journey without telling them too much, without overwhelming them with information about what the research was all about. I found that quite a balance, but I think I was lucky in terms of the time. I think the time is so prime right now for discussing, for consumers wanting to discuss clothing sustainability, that there was something in their curiosity. But at the same time as the researcher, I had to manage that and make sure I didn't get too involved in their curiosity. My entire focus was on my focus and reason for being there. So I think it was about learning that balance as I went along and really bringing them into it. And the more I brought them in, the more they shared, and that was really amazing.
I mean, both of your research is focused in the home, in that domestic setting, as you said, and obviously that does raise kind of challenges beyond ethical approval and being mindful of that experience. Do you both want to say a bit more about how you manage that in practice?
Manage research in the home. Yeah, I mean, I think that the ideal scenario is where you are reflexive about it in an ongoing way, because I think that something that I did without realizing how useful it would be was I kept a kind of diary, an ethnographic diary, and that was so useful. And I now tell all my PhD students, do it, because even if you're doing a kind of interview study, because it's a really useful space to make sure that you are remaining reflexive about the kind of issues that come up when you're doing research in the home. Because I think doing research in the home, you can, like all qualitative research, you can plan it, but you don't necessarily know what you're going to uncover. And for example, you can sometimes doing research, actually people think, oh, I'm just talking about my clothing, or I've done other research into objects in the home. And actually it can end up being quite distressing to people, or, say clothing that reminds them of somebody who is no longer there, or a relationship that has fallen apart. And I think there are kind of negotiations around that, actually, that people are surprised by, and then also you have to negotiate those things. But I think another issue is also around these ideas of the unseen spaces of the home, and that actually doing research into clothing, it kind of involves going into people's bedrooms and into their wardrobes, and actually looking in someone's wardrobe. I was aware in some of my interviews that actually probably no one else has been here apart from the person who owns it. And so that's a very intimate space. And I think negotiating that and trying to remain kind of attuned to questions of, appropriateness and ongoing, I guess, negotiation of that ethical dimension.
Yeah. Sophie, actually, that's a really good point that you make about, and I completely forgot that I kept a reflexive diary myself. And one of the things actually in the reflexive diary is your own personal safety and vulnerability. And another thing that I did actually was I asked a fellow researcher to do an interview with me as if to interview me for my research in my wardrobe, to see how I felt about it. And I felt that vulnerability in terms of the intimacy of actually having someone who I knew as a colleague in my own wardrobe and asking me the questions that I was going to ask other people. And it was really an important experience of understanding that vulnerability and how you need to manage and nurture your participants.
Yeah, I think that point about being interviewed by another colleague is a really interesting one, where you can, kind of putting yourself in the position of the participant. And something I've done is when I first started my current research project, which is about still within the home. It's not just clothing, it's looking at dormant things, the things people keep but they're not using anymore. And when I first did it, I piloted it and I did a few presentations where I used photos from my own house. So photos of my junk drawer and, items I've kept. And it was a really strange experience, because there I was seeing photos of kind of my home, up on a massive screen and in a conference. And actually it was a really good experience for me, that, because you realize, again, this is, going back to the photographic image around actually taking photos is a really useful thing as a researcher, but there are still ongoing ethics about showing those photos, because even though you've got full consent to show them, sometimes you think, actually, but how much do people fully know the context in which they're being shown? And I'm not entirely convinced people always do.
Yeah, again, I think going back to the reflexive diary on that point, I think I use my reflexive diary to reflect on my bias, what I thought I would do in terms of the stained saturation of a garment, what I would then be evaluating myself, what I would do. And so that sort of subjectivity of someone else's garments. So I'm coming away from an interview and I'm reflecting on what I experienced and thinking about the different garments that I saw and how personal those evaluations are, and being mindful of those evaluations being such a personal and intimate decision-making process that, you can't get away from that. And you always have to be mindful of it in terms of the analysing the data once you have it all. Yeah.
I think that's the thing about doing this research into clothing in the home, in that that's why it matters, because you're getting to these intimate aspects of clothing, which are so central to why people wear clothing, why they keep clothing, why they dispose of clothing. But in researching them, then there are various methodological challenges, aren't there, around researching something so intimate and embodied, and you've talked about kind of dirt and things like that. And so actually I think that the thing about them that's most valued about these methods is also the biggest methodological challenge. And I think it does require quite a lot of researcher skill really to do that, which you gain obviously through training, but also through doing. And I think for me, I learned a lot through doing, through, kind of experimenting and seeing what worked, and kind of what are suitable boundaries within which we can do the research.
And then thinking about that creativity, where you get into a situation, you realise that things need to shift or other opportunities arise. It'd be interesting to hear about how you manage that process, that kind of, I guess, the creativity and flexibility once you've gone in to the site of the research.
Yeah, I think that's the advantage, I guess, of an ethnographic approach, in the sense in which it is, as I said earlier, by definition, multi-method. And so you make plans, but also the virtue of a kind of ethnographic approach is it is open-ended. And so let's say you're doing just an interview, you have the creativity, and the possibility to ask different questions. But I think when you're actually in people's homes and you're kind of looking at their wardrobes, you do have scope to think, well, actually, what really matters here? And I remember planning my methodology and thinking, I can't do this in the abstract. I can't do this without actually going into someone's home and looking at the clothes. So I did a few pilots, for example, and that really helped. But, things like, we've already mentioned the diaries, but I hadn't planned to do that at all. But when I was there in someone's house and I was asking them about, I was really interested in what people didn't wear, what they didn't put on, not just what they wore. And people didn't remember. They just didn't remember what they'd tried on and got rid of. And I thought, I've got to do a diary here, haven't I? So I think, a lot of it is because thinking about clothing is a kind of, there is reflexivity around it, but also people do a lot of it habitually, and that they put stuff on and they don't necessarily verbalize it. So it's about how you get to that. And I think you sort of have to be creative really to start to understand those kind of spaces.
Yeah, I think there's also something about the unpredictability and being adaptable and resilient. Like, I found that with some of the interviews, there were children present, there were babies. People were just getting on with their everyday lives. They would have a chat with you and they'd have a baby, might be nursing that baby. Other homes, there was like a really excited dog who was going from room to room as well. And the participant was managing their space physically. So they were managing their dog and having a chat. And then you're realizing in a sensorial way that this space, the idea that there's a dog, there's children, there's the participant, all of this is feeding in to why there is this household wardrobe, or why there are these different items of clothing or garments, and what impact these different situations have on the clothing we have in our wardrobes. And so that sort of dynamic is really, from an observer's point of view, is really a creative dynamic, because you're seeing people in action, in their almost like they're on TV, like a soap opera, but you're there, you're in it, and you have the privilege of observing their performance, which is multi faceted, minute to minute. And then somebody might ring the doorbell, and again they have to adapt. You're adapting the interview, they're adapting you being in their house. And so this adaptation all the time leads to the researcher having to be creative and resilient.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because on one level, it can, let's say you've got a really busy household. It makes it difficult to kind of do an interview. You think, oh gosh, am I in the way? You're trying to cook dinner whilst I'm also interviewing you. But in other ways, it is really helps you understand the texture of people's lives. And actually, even if what you're interested in maybe is clothing, is about what they get rid of or what they keep, but actually all of that is informed, isn't it, by the fact that they've got a dog and they've got 2 children and they're also, working from home. All of these things are part of it. And actually, if you just did like an interview not in the home, you wouldn't get all of that. People wouldn't necessarily reflect on it. And so I think that again is one of the advantages of going into the home, is that yes, you're in this kind of like uncontrolled setting where you can't control, who's going to be there, what noises are going to be there, and someone's going to come to the door and you're going to have to stop the interview and they'll forget what they've done. You can't control all of that, but actually that is life, isn't it? And really, even if you're trying to understand clothing, we're trying to understand it in life, because that's what clothing is part of. And so I think that's kind of, that what you've just described is really what I think is the richness of ethnography, the richness of research in the home. And it's hard, but it's also exciting as well.
Yeah, and I think that would apply as well, Lynn, thinking about your journeys with your informants, to disposal points and what you learn just through the process of the way that they undertake that journey.
Absolutely. Again, sort of walking with a participant. Like, for example, there was one participant that I met at her front door, and then we walked together to her local high street fashion store clothing disposal drop-off point. And so we had this conversation on the way, and then you learn why they're walking. You learn why they've chosen that particular depot. You learn how long it takes. And then the spatial element of the whole idea of clothing disposal becomes really interesting and really important, sort of that accessibility of consumer engagement with the external space, with the environment, and how important that is to the clothing decision-making process. And it suddenly becomes really real when you're just walking along. It's almost like part of your semi-structured interview process, but it's much more informal, because you're not walking along with your microphone necessarily or your recorder. You're having this real conversation where you might be exchanging because you're in a public space. So it's like walking along with a colleague. And that brings a different dimension and a whole rich new set of data. I went again with another participant to a refugee drop-off point. And again, that was really interesting when you get there, because then you're interacting with the informant or the participant, with the informant and the people at the drop-off point. And then you get to have impromptu little interviews with the people managing the refugee point. And you get to understand a lot more about, wow, here we are in a really warm church hall, which is a really clean environment, compared to, again, going myself in to do observational research in my local recycling centre, which is in a car park. And sort of you're really, again, sensorially aware of the difference between this internal space and this external space, and what it means for how consumers make that decision-making process about one garment as opposed to another garment. And all these nuances of moving around with your participant outside of the home. So from the home outside to another environment, it was so important. And an area that I'd like to do a lot more of, actually.
I think in, sort of thinking about going forward about areas that might be really interesting to do research around, I think it would be things like that about, because obviously the ways in which people participate in recycling or even shopping, it is a situated individuals. We are situated in our lives and in our homes, and actually making that journey, you can start to understand the routes, but I just mean the physical routes, also the journeys that people take to get there, and actually all sorts of things around what those process evaluations are in the home and how that leads then to things like disposal. And I think when I did my research into clothing, it was pretty much all in the home. And I think actually I would have loved to do, also it would be really interesting to do shopping with people. So to do kind of walks and shop alongs and things. And actually that's kind of similar to what you're talking about, the disposal, but to really see the ways in which people shop and how you make that journey to the shops with them. And you can really, I think, start to bring together different kind of levels of understanding. And especially if you spent that time in the home with them, they're bringing that with them, but you're also, as a researcher, bringing that understanding with them, because you kind of make the journey together, don't you? So I think it's a really interesting avenue for sort of developing research in this area.
Sophie, that's a really nice way, I guess, to segue in. Lynn, it'd be nice to hear a bit about what you feel are key directions for future research in terms of circularity and sustainability of clothing in and around the home.
Thanks, Deirdre. So one thing we haven't talked about in terms of my research is that I actually conducted industry interviews as well. And those were semi-structured, just one method. But what that brought up was the misalignment, the challenge between what the consumer is doing in the home and what the industry want the consumer to do, or what would be good if the consumer was more aware of in order to improve the circulation of post-consumer clothing. And so what I would like to see is a lot more, or to do is a lot more research in this area, as I say, between what the consumer is doing and how that's impacting on, so what the consumer is doing at the micro level in the home and how that's impacting at the macro level when it gets to the drop-off point. And I think it's about, marrying those two together somehow in terms of methods. But in the home, I just started that journey. You know, that period was so short, 3 to 6 months. And I think it would be amazing to do really longer periods of research where, like you say, Sophie, you go with someone to buy a garment, you observe them, you engage with them through the whole life cycle of that garment to the point of disposal and decision making on disposal. I think those sort of very long-term research studies can really help us understand things that shorter term studies, we can learn a lot, but we can learn a lot more the more we engage with the same sample of consumers.
Yeah, I think that that also kind of relates to the methodological points about what can facilitate sort of our greater understanding of some of these issues around circularity. And I think the idea of kind of longer term, but it wouldn't have to be longer term intensive necessarily. It could be kind of a staged process, I guess. So where you do kind of follow up after a year sort of thing. And actually, I think having the opportunity to really see then how is that thing that they've bought embedding in the wardrobe, have they already got rid of it? Or, now that you do some research, let's say, in how people get rid of clothing, you go back a year later, what's happened? Have they renewed that with a load of new stuff, or are they still kind of, working through the stuff they've already got? And I think doing those kind of, periodic follow-ups, I think would be really insightful. And I don't think there's enough of that yet, probably. I think it's a real area for a development, because I think you can really start to see, actually, when you do a short-term project, you can get loads, as you say, we can get loads of insight into what people do. But I think that a lot of our relationship to clothing is quite long-term. So let's say things that people keep and they wear all the time, or thinking about even like a new item, how that people anticipate is going to be like something they're going to wear forever and they're not going to just dispose of. Is that really the case? Is that happening? And if not, why doesn't it happen? And I think you can only really get to that, I think, probably by following up with people, kind of over particular time periods. So I think there's a lot of potential in that area.
Yeah, I think that just reminded me that a lot of my data revealed that participants are really, consumers are very skilled in keeping a garment in use for long, extending the use of a garment and extending the use of a textile. So over a period of time, you could see how they either adapt a garment or what they showed me was examples of products they'd made from post-consumer garments. One incredible example was a little crochet pot made out of a participants' husband's underpants, and they'd been made into like a cotton yarn and then crocheted into a little basket, and that was then embedded in the home as the little vessel to keep the household keys in. And that idea of how then this this longevity of fibre extends into the home. Again, these are things, like you say, Sophie, if you're periodically engaging in someone and learning their stories of what they're doing, the data set is so unexpected. And it gives you that excitement of, you just sometimes don't know what you're going to find.
I think that's a really interesting point about that you're making about how people sort of are actually really skilled. If they want to keep something in use and they don't want to get rid of it, they will do. And so certainly something that I found in my more recent research, which isn't into clothing, the stuff that's into things people keep but they aren't using anymore, is a lot of people keep things not because they're kind of materialistic or they want to have loads of stuff or they're disorganized. They keep things because they want them to stay in use, but they don't know how to do that. And actually, it's only kind of by really understanding that we can start to think about things like circularity. And so, you've got an example there around someone who does recycle something, but, maybe some people don't have the skill to do that, but they would like to be able to, and they'd like to be able to have that thing sort of going back into circulation. And again, that kind of mirrors other things that I found around jeans, where people would love to just keep wearing the same style and brand, but the brand stopped producing that style. And so they wear it for a few years, they fall apart, they go back to buy it and they can't. And so I think it's, there's so much kind of untapped research area there, and thinking about actually in what ways are consumers kind of really savvy and able to keep things in use, albeit in different ways to their original intention. But also, what about when people don't have the capacity but they would like to? And I think there's a really interesting potential to think around kind of developing research into that area.
Sophie, just picking up on the point about doing research in a staged approach, Kat and I did a piece of research where we were looking at consumers changing their clothing consumption to more sustainable approaches. And what we did was exactly that we started out with the initial phase of research and understanding what they did currently and looking at the behavioural change that they wanted to take forward and really working that through with them, and then touching base with them regularly over a period of 1 year. And that was really interesting because for a lot of people, what happened was the change that they wanted to make in terms of their own behaviour shifted into and evolved into something quite different by the end of that process, as they realised that they came across barriers or challenges, or it wasn't it didn't play out in the way that they expected it to, and they rethought and sought to kind of sense make that behaviour, and it shifted and evolved into something quite different. And I think part of that was that while they made a decision to change to a more sustainable approach, once they take that back and embed that into their kind of everyday practices and what they do, that could be quite challenging. So they're negotiating a change in behaviour, but within the context of what they feel they can achieve in terms of their everyday.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because I think that in terms of behaviour change, it probably is where you need to do those return visits, because actually, people can have all sorts of aspirations, but there's all sorts of practical, pragmatic reasons where maybe that won't work out. And I think really, if you're trying to look at long-term behaviour change, you really need those return visits, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's making me think we need to go back even beyond that period, because of course things do evolve and shift. And I think what we feel we may have learned, or for what in some cases might have looked like a failure in terms of achieving what they initially set out to do, it just evolved and shifted into something quite different. And I think that process of sense making that people actually make was a really rich part of the data, like that in terms of where they ended up and why they ended up there.
No, I can imagine that. And I think it's also that's about reflexivity, isn't it? And not just your reflexivity, their reflexivity. And actually, if they are kind of conscious of where they started that journey, by doing those return visits, you get there not only what they're doing, but you're also getting how they're reflecting on that original position. And I think that's really interesting, isn't it? And probably a key part of kind of how people change what they do. It's not just habitual and unexpected, it is reflexive as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And as that research was focused on mindfulness, we were asking people to be quite mindful of what they do and to engage in that kind of reflection as well. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed being part of the conversation today. Thank you both.
And thank you, Sophie, and thank you so much, Deirdre, for supporting the facilitation of this discussion. Sophie, your insights and your sharing have been so valuable to me as an early researcher in this field. It's really great to get your insights. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. It's been a really interesting discussion.
Thank you for listening and watching Cleaning the Loop, Driving Consumer Clothing Circularity, a podcast series produced by the Adam Smith Business School, University of Glasgow. If you would like to know more about my research or that of the scholars participating in the podcast series, please email me at lynn.wilson@glasgow.ac.uk. Thank you for listening and watching.